Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to the Moms at Work speaker series. We have a very special guest today. I'm very excited, and I'm going to pass it right on over to her so she can do a quick introduction.
Hello, everybody. My name is Karen Jansen. I am the first Federal Pay Equity Commissioner, and that's a big mouthful, but I'll explain that in a minute, what that's all about. I'm also a mom of 4 kids, ranging in age from 19 to 25. And for pretty much all of their childhood, well, in fact, all of their childhood, I worked part-time or full-time, most of the time full-time. I was, I would say that I experienced my share of gender discrimination during my time as a lawyer. I also experienced some pretty amazing attitudes towards women in law. And on the negative side, I was told by a union rep that I would never progress through the ranks if I didn't stop having kids. And then on the positive side, well, it sounds negative, but it was actually positive. I under-negotiated my salary quite considerably for one job that I started. And about 6 months into my job, the employer came to me and said, you know what, like you did a terrible job of negotiating your salary, but we're going to do something about that. We're going to adjust your salary so that it's in line with your male peers. Okay. I was so blown away by that, by their integrity and their honesty, that I became super committed to that law firm. And so in 2019, when I was appointed Federal Pay Equity Commissioner, I was really excited about the idea of addressing the gender wage gap.
Right.
Something that I've done in my career a lot. I did a lot of litigation around the gender wage gap, and what I'm committed to is making sure that I demystify the laws around the gender wage gap and make them understandable to everyone, so that all together as a society we can address this persistent problem.
Great. And I'm going to tell everybody I had so many questions for Karen that she was nice enough to put together slides for us today, because I felt it was so important that people have this information and that they can share it. I know a lot of our members are on employee resource groups at their work, they're at women's group, and I think this piece is so important for people to understand the incoming legislation and all of the things that our new Pay Equity Commissioner is going to be doing. So without further ado, I'm going to screen share. So just give me a sec, everybody. And Karen is going to walk us through some of these slides and all of the new information. One sec. Share my screen. And now we know how to do this because we were practicing. And we're going to start right here.
Perfect.
Perfect.
Allison, if you wouldn't mind advancing to the next slide, I'll just explain what I'm going to talk about today.
Right. I'm going
to try and explain to you 5 important points. The first one is that the gender wage gap in Canada continues, unfortunately, to exist. The second is that there are laws to address this, and I'm going to explain those laws to you. The third is that pay equity laws address part of the wage gap, and I'm going to talk about how it does that. And then I'm going to talk about proactive pay equity laws, which are laws that are designed to encourage employers or require employers to proactively examine their pay practices to make sure there is no inequity in them. And the fifth is that there is this new proactive pay equity law in Canada that applies to people in the federal workplace. And I'm going to explain to you the difference between the federal workplace and the provincial workplace, so you'll know if this new law applies to you in your workplace.
Great. And I'll point out that we have members from across Canada. So that's why it's very important that people pay attention to which ones are federal and which ones are provincial, because it will adjust.
Yeah, and I'll explain all that.
Great.
So just to start out with, people are often really surprised by the fact that in Canada, despite the fact that we've had, the feminist movement that's been very active addressing gender discrimination, we still have a significant wage gap. And in 2019, in fact, a woman in Canada earned only 88 cents on the dollar, on the male dollar, which is equivalent to a $3.87 average hourly wage gap, or a 12% gap. That's pretty significant, and clearly it's something that we have to do something about. And so in many jurisdictions in Canada, legislation has been passed to deal with that. So there are different kinds of gender wage gaps. That $3.87 gap is comprised of different kinds of wage gaps, which is a bit confusing, but I'll explain it to you. So you have the kind of a gap where two people, for example, in this example I'm providing, Chalet and Govinder, they start work for the same company on the same day in the same role. And Chalet, like me, negotiated her annual salary at $5,000 less than Govinder. And so she's starting out right off the bat, earning less than her male counterpart for exactly the same salary. And if this difference is not justified by different skill levels, different experience levels, it may be contrary to human rights legislation and also employment standards legislation. So human rights legislation would say that it's discriminatory to maintain a difference in wages for no other reason than gender. And what we see is that often women do, unfortunately, negotiate their starting salaries at less than men. And this creates right off the hop a wage gap based on gender. And the next kind of gender wage gap that can emerge is when you have different opportunities for promotion. So Chalet, for example, had a child and went off on mat leave for a year. And when she got back, she competed for a promotion. Govinder got the promotion, and Chalet was told that that was because he had been actively working longer than she had. And she suspected that that had to do with the 1 year mat leave that she took. So this may, and I say may, be an example of gender-based discrimination because, you know, it really depends on the fact scenario. But if both Chalet and Govinder have similar skills and experience, with the exception of that 1 year mat leave, Chalet may be able to prove that the employer has discriminated against her on the basis of her gender because as a woman, she gave birth to a child, she took a mat leave, and as a result, she had less experience. But again, this will really depend on the facts. So that's another example of how a gender wage gap can emerge over time in the workplace.
Right. I'm going to stop because these are not uncommon things to happen, right? Exactly. These are things that we've both heard, and you gave an example that even you yourself under negotiated. So I'm going to ask a question really quickly. Is people are reading this and they're saying, you know, it's human rights legislation. Do you need a lawyer to go and make a claim at the human rights through human rights?
That's a great question, Allison. No, you do not. And human rights legislation all across Canada, whether it's in the provinces or it's federal, is designed to be accessible to people without a lawyer. So you can get the forms online. You can go online and the material is there. And there's also people that will provide you with assistance in completing the forms. And then the process is designed so that you can move through it on your own. And, you know, and it should be able to, you should get the support that you need proceeding through the human rights process without a lawyer.
Great. Okay. All right.
So another kind of a gender wage gap, and this is the kind of the gender gap, excuse me, that I am dealing with mainly in my role as the Pay Equity Commissioner, is different pay for work of equal value. So that is where you have two different jobs. And in this example, we have Maria, who's an account technician, and Amir, who's a mechanic. And you would think, well, we can't really compare those two jobs because they're different. But if you look at what they do, sometimes, in fact, you can compare them. So in this case, Maria, as an account technician, keeps financial records, maintains and balances accounts, prepares payroll, completes and submits forms, and prepares reports. The training usually required is a college education and specialized training or apprenticeship training. Amir who is a mechanic, adjusts, repairs, and replaces parts and components of commercial trucks and truck trailer systems, and similarly has a college education with specialized training or apprenticeship training. And so what we ask when we're talking about different pay for work of equal value, if you skip to the next slide, is whether those two jobs are actually of equal value based on the skill, effort, responsibility, and the working conditions of each job. So if we can say that even though Maria and Amir do different jobs, they both require the same level of skill, the same level of effort, have the same responsibility, and work in the same kinds of conditions. And by working conditions, I mean similarly challenging circumstances, time pressures, deadlines, competing considerations, that kind of thing. If they end up being this comparable in terms of those four criteria, then they should be paid the same, even though they're different jobs.
And can you maybe, so you mentioned that this is sort of a key part of what you're going to be doing as pay equity commissioner. Are these issues brought forward by organizations? So how did they get to you, or how do you get to these issues? Is a really quick question.
Yeah, so that's the piece that I was referring to at the beginning, the proactive pay equity legislation. So in some jurisdictions, employers have to do this proactively. They have to examine their compensation practices, and they have to compare apples and oranges. They have to compare mechanics and account technicians among the whole array of other jobs in their workplace. And they have to ensure, they have to actually measure the value of each of those male predominant and female predominant jobs, and they have to compare the compensation. And they have to do that proactively, that is, without a complaint having been filed by anyone. Puts the responsibility and the onus on employers to proactively look at their compensation and determine if it's fair in terms of female and male predominant work. So as this slide says, pay equity, which is what I'm in charge of on the federal level, compares jobs that are commonly done by women and jobs commonly done by men, even if the work is different.
Right.
And what it addresses is the undervaluation of women's work, which is a significant factor in the gender wage gap. So if you think about Amir and Maria, I bet some of you were thinking, well, you know, Amir, he works as a mechanic. That's harder. That's harder than being an account technician. And I think that there is that, and that is the basis of pay equity analysis, is there's a little bit of a gender bias that into our thinking around the kind of work that men and women typically do. So caregiving work, the clerical work, that kind of thing, the sales work that women have tended towards and where they predominate has been undervalued. It's seen as something that we all do, especially caregiving. Well, we're mothers, and so of course it's natural for us to take care of people. And that means that it's not really that complicated, it's not really that valuable or that hard, so we'll pay it less. And unfortunately, that is the bias that has crept into the way that we value and pay predominantly female work.
Yeah. All right, next one here.
So as I mentioned, proactive pay equity legislation requires that employers get on top of that they have a look at their compensation systems. And there's no requirement for someone to complain and say, hey, look, I think that I'm being paid unfairly relative to another job. The employer actually has to do that on their own. And even if they don't think they have a pay gap, they have to have a look at it. And if it turns out that they do have a pay gap, that the work in their workplace that's done predominantly by female workers is paid less than the work done predominantly by male workers, then they have to make a wage adjustment, and they have to maintain that wage adjustment and pay equity over time.
All right. And I think this is important for our viewers to note that that's why this is such proactive legislation, is that before people were required to complain, like if there was an issue, you would have to go through, and that can be a very scary thing for people to do because this is their job and their livelihood. So this new legislation, in a greatly needed way, will have people do all the legwork before employers.
Exactly.
The onus on their employers. It's great.
Exactly.
This is an important one.
Yeah, this is very important. This shows you where in Canada you find this kind of proactive pay equity legislation, that is where employers are required to act without a complaint prompting them to do so. The circle that isn't shaded in represents where there is proactive pay equity legislation, but only in the public sector, that is only in government. So, or para-government. That's Manitoba, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and Prince Edward Island. That's where there is this proactive pay equity legislation, but it's only in the public sector.
Okay.
Whereas in Ontario and Quebec, they have proactive pay equity legislation that applies to both the public and private sectors. So government and, retail firms, insurance, all kinds of businesses are covered. All businesses are covered by this obligation. And now, as the next slide shows, the one after that, shows the federal sector is now covered by this same proactive pay equity legislation, and it applies to both the private and the public sector, and it applies to all employers who have an average of 10 employees or more. The thing to note is that the Pay Equity Act is not yet in effect. There's been some delays related to COVID, but we're expecting it to come into force next year. And that's going to be really important. Up until till then, the Canadian Human Rights Act applies.
Right. So can you maybe talk, so for people who aren't familiar with how acts go through, so this act has already been passed through Parliament in 2008. Yep. And so then what are sort of the next steps that put it into effect? Is there anything else that needs to be done, or?
Yes, exactly. Parliament needs to bring it into force. Needs to say, as of X date, this legislation is in effect. And from that date on, employers will have 3 years to analyze their compensation systems. Okay. So once they declare it in force, and regulations as well that are now being have been drafted, and those regulations, there's a period of time for comments on those regulations, and that's in effect right now. And those are important regulations that will tell employers exactly how they have to do the pay equity analysis. If we go to the next slide.
And I was going to ask a quick question,
sure.
because this is federal, and I know a lot of people have been, this may come up later, in Ontario, there was pay transparency legislation that was supposed to come through. It kind of got put on the back burner, sent back for more public consultation. And I think some of my members had asked, is there a chance that could happen with this? Or, is it pretty firm that it's going to be coming through in 2021?
Yeah, so this is where, the whole pay gap legislation things gets complicated. Right. So you're right. In the Ontario jurisdiction, there was pay transparency legislation that was to have come into effect, and it was decided not to bring that into effect. Pay transparency is different from pay equity. So pay transparency requires employers to publish information about the wage gaps in their workplace. Right. And the hope behind that is that will prompt them to do something about the problem because it's publicly accessible.
Right. Yes.
So the federal government has taken up where the Ontario has left off.
Right.
Has essentially picked up that ball and is running with it. And there will be pay transparency regulations that will come out pursuant to the Employment Equity Act fairly soon, which will also, as in Ontario, will require employers to provide information, not just about the pay gaps for women, but also visible minorities, people with disabilities, and Indigenous people, so that it will be readily transparent what the pay gaps are within given workplaces between those different groups and other workers. Great. So that's coming.
Yeah, and that's great. And that's sort of an important piece where that, like, I don't even know if you're the right person to be like, thank you, because the federal government has done in my opinion, done a phenomenal job in picking up that piece. Like, that was very disappointing that some of that was dropped, and the federal government has sort of like swept in and taken a lot of those pieces. So this is a great slide, because this is really in a nutshell what's going to be required.
That's right.
And timelines, right?
That's right. So all federal employers, and don't worry about this, I'm going to have a slide that's coming up that will tell you the difference between federal employers and provincial employers is. That's important. But federal employers like banks, like telecommunication companies, railway companies, they will all have to analyze their compensation system and post a pay equity plan within 3 years. And then if there are any differences in pay based on genders, they have to increase the compensation in those jobs that are commonly done by women. So if you have men in those jobs, they too will receive an increase in compensation.
Right. So, and when they say you have to post the plan, which is in the legislation, because I know this has been asked, like, is that posted publicly? Is that posted?
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. It has to be. It has to be visible. The plan, I should say, does not have to be. It has to be visible to employees, because the idea is that employees will be given a period of time within which they can provide their own comments on that, their critiques or their comments. So that has to be accessible to all employees in the workplace. And then the employers will be required to update their pay equity plan at least every 5 years and submit an annual statement to my office to ensure that they're keeping up to date.
Okay. All right. Next one here.
So lots of people will be asking themselves, okay, if I think I have a pay equity problem, if I think I'm not being paid equitably as compared to the men in my workplace, how do I go about dealing with that? And so you have to first ask yourself 2 questions. One, is it federal law or provincial law that applies to your work? And 2, what kind of a pay gap problem do you have? And you'll recall, I went through 3 different kinds of pay gap problems.
Right.
So you need to kind of analyze that. So the next slide tells you a bit about what the difference is between federal and provincial. So the Constitution, Canadian Constitution, sets out who's responsible for what, whether it's federal parliament or the provincial legislatures. And the federal parliament is responsible for only about 8% of Canadian workers, which is really the smaller proportion. Most people are, their workplace is governed by provincial law. But 8% of Canadians who are spread out across Canada will find themselves within the federal jurisdiction. And that will be people who work in banking, telecommunications and communications like radio, television, and that kind of thing. Interprovincial transportation like OC Transpo, because it goes across the Ontario and Quebec border. Right. Airlines, maritime shipping, railways, interprovincial roads, and crown corporations like Canada Post, Via Rail, CN, that kind of thing. Those are federally regulated, as well as the federal public sector and parliamentary institutions. But if you skip to the next slide, you'll see that the provincial sector is really the lion's share of, most workplaces are governed by provincial legislation. Insurance companies, retails, restaurants, local service industry, healthcare agencies, provincial municipal governments, education systems, schools, college. Most people will be governed by provincial legislation.
Right. Yeah.
And so then you look at the second question that I was talking about, what kind of a pay problem do I have? Is it because I'm being paid different pay for the same work as what my male colleague is doing? And if that's the case, you turn to human rights law, typically provincial law in any of the jurisdictions you live in, or employment standards legislation, which prohibits unequal pay for equal work. And then, as we discussed, the pay transparency regulations that are coming out will also require employers to identify what are pay gaps within the workplace for the same work.
Okay.
And if it's because you think you've been treated differently, like Chalet and Govinder or like Chalet, really, where you feel that you've been denied an opportunity based on your gender, or there's a policy or practice in the workplace that that affects or pay as a woman, again, you turn to the human rights legislation in your own province. And as I mentioned, you can do that without a lawyer.
Right.
There's also in the federal jurisdiction, what's called employment equity legislation, that is a separate area, but that's to try and eliminate barriers that exist for women and visible minorities, disabled people, and Indigenous people in moving through the organization and in being retained and promoted.
Right.
And then finally, if you think that your pay is different, even though the work that you're comparing it to is of comparable value, then you can prompt your employer. I mean, there is proactive obligation on the employer to undertake that analysis, but there are times when employers are not paying attention to their obligations under the pay equity legislation, and do need a prompt to be reminded that they have those obligations. And as I showed you in that map, some provinces have that kind of legislation, and the federal jurisdiction does now have that kind of legislation, pay equity legislation.
So I'm going to ask a question because we have a lot of HR people and a lot of HR people who are going to say, okay, how do I do this properly? Is there resources on your website? Is like, how are HR people, what's the best way for them to sort of learn about how to do this sort of analysis?
Yes, absolutely. I would just point out that both Ontario and Quebec that have proactive pay equity legislation like what exists in the federal jurisdiction, they have tremendous resources on their website about how to do the process step by step. We're following suit. So my office is right now building some incredible tools, some software tools that will allow employers to input their information, and then the tool do the work for you to calculate the wage gap and wage adjustment. It is, and we followed the lead of Quebec. The Quebec Equity Commission developed a tool like that. It was very, very helpful. We're doing the same thing. It'll start out as an Excel-based tool, and then we'll eventually migrate to the cloud. But it's going to be very useful for employers and completely confidential for them to download onto their own systems and do the analysis. And we also have guidance documents that we're producing to assist employers to understand what their obligations are, to assist employees to understand what their rights are. And that will all be available on our website. And here's the email address.
Yes.
Anybody that wants to pose questions to our team, we have a tremendous team of experts that can assist. And the next slide gives you our Twitter handle. So it's a little bit of a mouthful, this Twitter handle.
Yeah.
Equisalarial, because we have to be bilingual in the federal government. We're proud to be bilingual. And so this Twitter handle will allow you to follow. We're really publishing a lot of information and a lot of insights so that people can really get a handle on these new obligations.
And so those tools are accessible for anybody. So even if you're not federally regulated, you can download and get the work started. Because I know there's a lot of HR people who are keen to be proactive on their own. So
that's a really good point, Allison. That is a really good point, because what I'm saying to people is that, especially now in the time of COVID, there's been this almost realization or awakening that a lot of people have had to the inequities that exist within our society, and a real hunger to do something about it. And the really intelligent employers are all about that now. They're looking at, how do we get ahead of this? How do we demonstrate to our workforce, because that's what's going to create a more productive workforce. How do we demonstrate to them that we are all about gender equality, race equality? And the tools that we're going to provide, and that are provided through Ontario and Quebec websites, pay equity websites, will assist those kinds of proactive, progressive employers to address the issue and demonstrate to their employees that they're committed to equity.
Yeah, and that's something that we're hearing a lot of, that people are very, very aware now and are very interested in being aligned with employers who are, who are leading the charge. So I think this is, this is great legislation. And I think it's important to remind people that, like, but they don't have to wait. If you're with an employer who, like, you don't have to wait to do these things. You don't have to wait for it to be legislated. You can go ahead and start working on it now, right?
And we're certainly hoping that other provinces follow suit in terms of passing legislation that will apply to the private and the public sector. And I might add that there is a really strong business case for getting on this. The research really clearly shows that those employers that value equity and diversity and get on it are able to attract top talent and outperform their competitors.
Yeah, and I think this is something that, I've been saying for a long time as an HR, like I do HR consulting as thing. I was like, this is your opportunity to stand out. This is your opportunity to show that you are an employer of choice, that you value women, especially in senior leadership. And it's just a great piece of legislation that I'm so excited is coming into force. And I want to encourage people, the email addresses are there, Twitter is there, it's accessible. I wanted to really hone in that you don't need a lawyer if you have a concern, that all the forums are available. There's assistance for you if you're having concerns. And for all the HR people who are looking to do it differently, they have an email address. I'm sure they would love to hear from you to help push this forward. So all of those resources are there and available. And I look forward to seeing that new Excel spreadsheet that's going to help with this. That's amazing. Any final thoughts for people if they need anything else or what to think?
I would just really encourage people, it can be a confusing area, but I would really encourage you to take the time. The resources are there to help you to understand it and to implement the legislation or to implement pay equity analysis within your workplace in a systematic and a thoughtful and careful way. And there are lots of people there like myself that are really anxious and eager to help you. So
great. So thank you so much for taking this time. I am really now looking forward to 2021 and all of this new exciting things. And from all of us here at Moms at Work, we'd like to say thank you. This is so important to so many of us for so many reasons who have been, whether under negotiated or who have been underpaid, that not only is this legislation here, but that you are heading the charge. And it's someone who deeply and intimately understands all of the things that we're experiencing. And that is so important to us. So thank you so much for being here. And as I said to everybody, we have an email address now. You have questions, go there. And I'm really looking forward to seeing what 2021 brings. So
thank you, Allison. It's my pleasure. I really appreciated this. It's wonderful. Thank you for giving me the opportunity.